Sarah and her husband had a video doorbell installed for almost 2 years before anything unusual ever showed up on it. The kind of camera most people forget is even running until they need it. It caught package deliveries, the occasional raccoon, neighborhood kids cutting through the yard. They lived on a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of street where nothing ever really happened, which was part of why they bought the house in the first place. Nothing about the camera had ever made either of them think twice about checking the app more than once a week, usually just to see a delivery confirmation. That changed on a Tuesday night in October. Sarah had gone to bed around 11, her husband a little after midnight, both of them asleep by the time anything happened. Around 1:40 a.m., Sarah's phone buzzed with a motion alert from the doorbell app. Nothing unusual by itself, since the camera was sensitive enough to trigger on passing cars, a stray cat, even heavy wind moving the porch plants. She'd learned to mostly ignore those alerts over the 2 years they'd had the system installed. Something about this one made her open the app anyway, half asleep, more out of habit than actual concern. The footage showed a man standing directly in front of the door, close enough that his face filled most of the frame, angled slightly downward like he was looking at the doorknob rather than the camera above it. He wasn't wearing anything that stood out. No mask, no unusual clothing, nothing that would explain the feeling Sarah described the moment she saw him. He simply stood there, still, for 11 full seconds, according to the timestamp, without moving, without reaching for the bell, without doing anything at all except standing close enough to the door that Sarah could hear, faintly, through the camera's microphone, what sounded like breathing. She woke her husband immediately, shaking him hard enough that he sat up already asking what was wrong before she'd said a word. She showed him the phone screen. The footage still paused on the man's face, and watched his expression change from groggy confusion to something much more alert. By the time he got to the window facing the front porch, no one was there. He checked the door, locked exactly as they'd left it, deadbolt still engaged. He grabbed a flashlight from the hallway closet and walked the full perimeter of the house in his bare feet, checking the side gate, the garage door, the fence line separating their yard from the neighbors. He found nothing, no footprints in the damp grass, which should have held an impression easily given how wet the lawn was that week. No sign that anyone had been on the property at all, aside from the 11 seconds of footage sitting on Sarah's phone as proof that someone very clearly had. They called the non-emergency police line that night, mostly because neither of them could imagine going back to sleep without at least reporting it. An officer came by around 3 a.m., reviewed the footage on Sarah's phone, and told them, honestly, that there wasn't much to go on. No crime had technically been committed, nothing had been taken or damaged, and a man standing on a porch, however unsettling, wasn't itself illegal. He suggested they keep the footage saved in case anything else happened. Sarah remembers feeling both reassured and completely unsatisfied by that answer at the same time. Here's where this story gets stranger, because when Sarah went back to review the footage the next morning, frame by frame, she noticed something in the recording that she hadn't caught the first time she watched it, late at night, half asleep and terrified. It's the kind of detail that only shows up once you slow a video down far past the speed it was ever meant to be watched at. And once you see it, you'll understand why she still hasn't been able to fully let this one go. Let's break down exactly what the footage shows. The footage, climax. Sarah sent the clip to her brother-in-law, who worked in IT and offered to look at it more closely, frame by frame, using software that let him slow the footage down and step through it second by second instead of watching it in real time. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Sarah described him as someone who debunked more of her paranormal adjacent curiosities over the years, than he'd ever validated, which was exactly why she trusted his take on this more than she would have trusted her own panicked assessment from that first sleepless night. He told her up front he expected to find a simple explanation, a lighting glitch, a compression artifact from the video codec, something boring enough to let everyone move on. What he found was in the first half second of the recording, a portion so brief that at normal playback speed, nobody would ever catch it. In that half second, before the man's face fully entered frame, the porch light behind him visibly dims, drops to almost nothing, and then returns to full brightness a split second later, exactly as he steps into full view. The doorbell camera's own infrared night vision sensor, which should have activated automatically in low light, shows a brief burst of visual distortion at the exact same moment, a kind of static ripple across the frame that the software flagged as a signal anomaly, not a hardware defect. Then there's the sound. When her brother-in-law isolated and amplified the audio from those 11 seconds, the breathing Sarah had heard was there, clearer now, slow, deliberate, and, according to him, layered. Not one person breathing. Two distinct breathing patterns, overlapping, one slightly higher pitched than the other, both perfectly in sync with each other's rhythm, which he said was the part that unsettled him most, because breathing that stays in sync like that, between two separate sources, isn't something that happens naturally. Sarah and her husband installed 2 additional cameras within the week, one covering the backyard, one covering the side gate, on top of the existing doorbell unit, along with a motion-activated floodlight that hadn't been there before. Neither of the new cameras has caught anything unusual since they went in. But Sarah told me she still has that original 11-second clip saved in 3 separate places: her phone, a cloud backup, and a flash drive she keeps in a drawer that has nothing else on it, because some nights, she said, she needs to go back and check that she didn't imagine it, or that it hadn't somehow been deleted or corrupted overnight. She hasn't yet. It's still there, exactly as it was the night it was recorded, timestamp and all, and she told me she has no plans to ever delete it, even though she also can't fully explain why she keeps it instead of just letting it go. A camera catching something it shouldn't, that's going to come up again, this time from someone who watched it happen live, in real time, from behind a convenience store counter. And this one has a twist to the footage that even the police couldn't explain. Overnight clerk, Nevada, setup. Marcus worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station just off the interstate, the kind of job where the security cameras mattered more than almost anything else in the building, for cameras covering the register, the entrance, the fuel pumps outside, and the single aisle in the back where the cooler doors line the wall. He'd worked that shift for almost 1.5 years by the time this happened, long enough to know the store's quirks better than almost anyone, which fluorescent tube flickered when it was about to die, which cooler compressor cycled loudly enough to hear from the counter, which hours of the night saw the most and least traffic. He'd never had a reason to think about those 4 cameras beyond routine shift change checks, glancing at the monitor bank out of habit more than actual vigilance. One night around 3 a.m., the store had been completely empty for almost 40 minutes. No customers, no traffic on the highway outside beyond the occasional set of headlights passing without slowing down. He was behind the counter doing inventory on the register screen, cross-referencing a clipboard against the shelf stock, when the monitor bank beside him, for small windows showing each camera feed, flickered, all 4 at once, for less than a second. He glanced up out of habit more than concern, expecting nothing more than a brief power fluctuation, the kind that happened maybe once a month and never amounted to anything. 3 of the 4 feeds looked normal. The 4th, covering the back cooler aisle, was showing something that made him stand up out of his chair immediately. The cooler door at the far end of the aisle, one of the tall glass front units for drinks, was standing wide open. Nobody had walked past the register to get to it. Marcus would have seen them. The aisle was in his direct line of sight from the counter, without even needing the camera. And yet there it was, open, cold air visibly fogging out into the aisle on camera in a way it never had before. He walked back to check it in person, taking his time, telling himself the whole way there that it was almost certainly a faulty hinge or a seal that had finally given out after years of use. He found the cooler door standing open exactly as the camera showed, nothing missing from inside. The drink selection sat undisturbed, rows of bottles perfectly aligned, and nothing on the tile floor beneath it. No puddle from melted ice, no scuff marks, nothing that suggested the door had been standing open for any real length of time despite the fogged glass suggesting otherwise. He closed it, pushed until he heard the latch click into place, tested it once by pulling gently to make sure it held, and walked back to the counter, telling himself it must have been a faulty hinge that had simply worked itself loose. He'd almost fully convinced himself of that by the time he sat back down and glanced at the monitor again, mostly just to confirm the door was still shut on camera the way it was in person. The door was open on the screen again. He turned around to look at it directly, in person, standing in the exact same aisle he'd just walked away from less than 10 seconds earlier. It was closed. If you're still with me, that's the setup. But the actual footage from that night is what got this story pulled into a local news segment, because of one detail investigators genuinely could not explain. If a video has ever caught something you couldn't explain, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm always looking for the next story like this. Now, here's what the recording actually showed. Marcus pulled the recorded footage the next morning before his manager arrived, mostly to convince himself he hadn't imagined the discrepancy between what the camera showed and what he'd seen standing in the aisle. What he found on playback was worse than the discrepancy itself. On the recording, the cooler door opens on its own at 3:07 a.m., exactly as he remembered. But scrubbing back frame by frame to the moment just before it opens, there's something visible reflected faintly in the glass door itself. For a duration the security company later confirmed was 4 frames, barely 1/6 of a second at the camera's recording rate. It's a shape, humanoid, standing at an angle the actual store layout doesn't allow for. There is no physical location in that aisle, based on the store's floor plan, where a person could stand and be reflected in that door at that angle. The reflection simply shouldn't be geometrically possible, according to the loss prevention consultant Marcus's company brought in after he reported the incident. When the footage is watched at real speed, that reflection is invisible. It's simply not something the human eye catches in 1/6 of a second. It only became visible when a technician slowed the file down for a routine review after Marcus's manager filed the incident report. The store's corporate office reviewed the footage, ran a full diagnostic on both the camera system and the cooler unit's hinge sensors, checked the power logs for any documented surge or brownout around the time of the incident, and found no technical malfunction with any of it. The official incident report, which Marcus was given a copy of after specifically requesting one, lists the cause simply as undetermined, no equipment fault identified. A regional loss prevention manager drove out personally to inspect the unit, spent almost 2 hours going through the camera housing and the cooler's internal wiring, and left without offering any further explanation beyond telling Marcus, off the record, that he'd seen weirder things at other locations, and none of them ever got a real answer either. Marcus requested a transfer to day shift 2 weeks later, and it was approved without much pushback once his manager reviewed the incident report. The store's other overnight clerks were shown the footage during a safety briefing not long after, according to Marcus. So people would take the buddy system seriously, though he suspects it was also just easier for management to frame it as a safety precaution than to admit nobody actually understood what had happened. Nobody who worked there afterward wanted to do inventory in that back aisle alone, and eventually, without any official policy change on paper, the overnight staff just quietly started doing that particular task in pairs, every single night, without ever really discussing why. A reflection that shouldn't be possible, caught in a fraction of a second nobody could see with the naked eye. Keep that in mind, because the final story in this video has a very similar detail, except this time, the person watching the footage back was a teenager, alone, in his bedroom, 2 days after a camping trip he almost didn't tell anyone about. This is also the story that comes with the most footage of the three, nearly 90 seconds of continuous recording, which means there's a lot more to slow down and study frame by frame than in either story before it. Tyler was 16 and had gone camping with 2 friends in a stretch of national forest his family visited every summer, far enough off the main trail that cell service disappeared almost as soon as they parked and started hiking in. It was a trip they'd done a dozen times before without incident, the kind of familiar, low-stakes camping that doesn't usually end up in a story like this one. They'd set up camp in the early evening, cooked over a small fire, and gone to bed a little after 11, all 3 of them crammed into a single 4-person tent with their gear stacked in the corners. On the second night, well after midnight, Tyler woke up to what he described as a scraping sound just outside the tent, slow and rhythmic, like something dragging across the dirt in a straight line back and forth, close enough that he could hear small rocks shifting under whatever was making it. He lay still for almost a full minute, listening, trying to convince himself it was a branch caught in the wind or an animal digging through the dirt for something to eat. The sound didn't stop, and it didn't sound like wind. It had a rhythm to it, deliberate and unhurried, that made his stomach tighten in a way he couldn't quite justify to himself in the moment. He grabbed his phone, more out of instinct than any real plan, and started recording through the thin mesh window of the tent, too afraid to unzip the flap and look directly, his hand shaking enough that the footage wobbles noticeably for the first several seconds before he manages to brace it against the tent frame. The footage, dark and grainy, shows almost nothing for the first 40 seconds, just the vague outline of trees against a slightly lighter night sky, and the audio of that scraping sound, clearly picked up by the phone's microphone, moving steadily from one side of the frame to the other. Then, around the 50-second mark, something crosses directly in front of the tent, close enough to block out a significant portion of the visible tree line for less than a second before it's gone. Tyler didn't sleep the rest of that night. He didn't wake his friends either, worried they'd think he'd panicked over nothing. A raccoon, a deer, something ordinary that fear had simply distorted in the dark. He lay awake listening to the sound continue, on and off, for almost another hour before it finally stopped sometime before dawn. When his friends woke up, he didn't mention it, and they hiked out later that morning without incident, nothing visibly disturbed around the campsite, no tracks either of them could identify with any confidence in the dirt near the tent. He didn't watch the video back himself until 2 days later, once he was home, in the daylight, with his mother sitting next to him at the kitchen table. He told me he'd almost deleted the clip without watching it at all, telling himself it was probably nothing, and he'd rather not relive the fear of that night for no reason. Something made him keep it instead, sitting untouched in his phone storage for 2 full days before curiosity, or maybe some instinct he couldn't quite name, got the better of him. This is the part of the story that made Tyler's mother change her mind about ever letting him camp in that spot again. And once you see what the footage actually shows when it's slowed down, you'll understand exactly why. When Tyler and his mother watched the video together for the first time, at normal speed, it looked exactly like what he described. A dark shape passing quickly across the frame, gone almost as soon as it appeared, easy enough to dismiss as an animal if you wanted to. His mother, a nurse with no particular interest in scary stories, wanted to dismiss it. Almost did. Then she asked him to play it again, slower this time, using the video app's built-in speed controls to drop it down to a quarter of its normal speed. At that speed, The shape crossing the frame resolves into something with a clearly upright posture, moving on what appears to be 2 limbs rather than 4, at a height that, based on a tape measure Tyler's father used against the same tree line the following weekend, would put it at somewhere close to 7 feet tall, if the proportions in the frame are accurate. It does not run on all fours the way a bear or deer would have startled in fleeing. It moves upright, in a single fluid motion, crossing roughly 12 feet of open ground between 2 trees in well under a second, a speed that Tyler's father, an avid hiker who has spent decades in that same forest, said he could not attribute to any animal native to that region moving in that posture. The audio, when isolated and cleaned up by a friend of the family who did some amateur sound editing, reveals that the scraping sound doesn't stop when the shape crosses the frame. It continues afterward, from a different direction than before, as though whatever made it had simply changed position and kept going, uninterrupted, entirely unbothered by having just been caught on camera. There's one more detail that came up when Tyler's father brought the footage to a local outdoor recreation group, mostly hoping someone with more wilderness experience might offer a mundane explanation he could feel good about. Nobody could. One member of the group, a retired forest ranger who'd spent almost 30 years working that exact district, watched the clip several times without saying much, then told them quietly that he'd heard secondhand reports over the decades of similar sightings in that same general area, always at night, always described the same way, always dismissed officially as bear activity despite witnesses insisting what they saw didn't move like a bear at all. He said he'd never put much stock in those reports before. He didn't say much else after watching Tyler's video, and Tyler's father told me the man seemed noticeably quieter for the rest of that meeting. Tyler's family has not been back to that campsite since. The video still exists, still gets shared occasionally within a small circle of people who've asked to see it, and still has no accepted explanation from wildlife experts, from skeptics, or from anyone else who's watched it and tried to name exactly what crossed that frame. Tyler told me the scraping sound is the part that stays with him most, not because of how it sounded, but because of how deliberate it seemed, like whatever made it wasn't trying to hide, and wasn't in any hurry at all.